So, all recording okay? Yeah, as I was saying, so this is, we'll be going over research I did. So this was my dissertation from the UCLDH program. And I'm gonna just go over, well, I'll show you what we're gonna do if that moves to the next one. So what we're going to go through today is a little bit of background in repatriation, why it's important. We're going to have a look over the methodology that we use for this research, going over some of the results that we found, leading into final conclusions. And then obviously we're going to open up to a Q&A. So if you have any questions or if you want me to go back to any particular slides or highlight certain areas, you're very welcome to ask about that at the end. So to start off with, the question is, what is repatriation? Repatriation as a term in itself is quite broad. So specifically what this research was interested in is the act of transferring ownership of an item kept in a heritage collection. So this doesn't include things like museum loans or anything like that. It is an object being having its ownership returned back to the community or place of origin where it was initially created. So why is repatriation important? Repatriation tends to come up a lot when discussing the decolonization of museum collections, especially in the UK, because a lot of material kind of came from these contexts, and repatriation as a practice kind of comes up from this discussion. That leads into, it has a really big, it has an impact on how you manage collection and the ethics around what museums will deaccession eventually. So it's very important from a museum perspective there. And then probably where most people are aware of it is from national, international discourse and legislation. So one of the most common examples that comes up quite a lot, where we've got some headlines there, is the Parthenon marbles, which are kept in the British Museum. Every couple of years, this as an issue comes back up. But more importantly, you know, it's the legislation that dictates what a lot of museums are able to do with their collections. So from that perspective, it's very important from a museum perspective. But that's only one aspect of it. Hello, do come in, no problem. Okay, do sit down. And then, so kind of from a UK museum and legislation perspective, it's important, but that's only one aspect of it. The other area is that it's very important for Indigenous communities who have these items returned to them. So here are just a couple of quotes from some of the case studies that we're going to look at later, of how it feels to have these items or remains returned back. So it has a very strong impact there. So that's kind of the background to repatriation in the UK, which leads us to the research questions we were looking to answer. So we're interested in the UK sector specifically, but there's not a lot of information about this area. So we were interested in a couple of different aspects. So what kind of items were being repatriated? Is there a specific type of material that's being repatriated, or is it a large mixture? We're looking at where repatriations are going to. So is it a particular set of countries? Is it going to a broad range, or is it just a couple of specific examples? In addition to that, what kind of organizations are receiving this material? Is it sort of a national museum? Is it going to the government? Or is it going to the source communities themselves? And then stemming from that is, where in the UK are repatriations coming from? What kind of organizations? Is it local museums? Is it private museums doing it? those are some of the questions we wanted to answer, and then taking those kind of main aspects. Does this change over time? So the period we're looking at is 2010 to 22. So this is only over 12 years. Do we see a big shift in this information, or is it pretty much the same throughout this period? So how were we going to find out about this? So initially we wanted to see what the literature says about repatriation practice in the UK. So from that, can we extract any predictions or observations that they come up with? So that gives us an idea on what we might find out later. So that goes into the statistical analysis. So in order to find out this information, we needed to collate a whole bunch of case studies from this period, transform the information and sort of the written material into a database so that we can analyze it. So from a statistical perspective, but also maybe do some visualizations on where material is coming from. So what did we find out? Firstly, looking at the literature, most of the literature doesn't directly talk about the sector in general. There are a couple of little nuggets we were able to find, however. One aspect that most of the literature did bring up was that they felt that there was an increasingly sort of positive attitude from the general public and from institutions towards repatriation. And we see this, coming from since like the 80s and 90s to today. And from that, so one of the few sort of more quantitative kind of approaches to this area that we were able to find was a museum and repatriation survey from 1997. This is mainly looking at museum policies going in. So it wasn't looking at the sector as a whole necessarily, but there was a couple of observations that they made. So one of them was what kind of communities are asking for repatriations, and what they say is disempowered Indigenous communities in Western industrialized nations. A bit of a mouthful, but this is areas like the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But they also highlight countries with extensive excavation history like Egypt. So most of what they concluded was that repatriations were happening pretty consistently across different types of institutions, so like local museums and private museums, but they noted that they didn't know any repatriations by university museums. And then another area which kind of gave a little prediction about repatriation was this article, Repatriation Developments in the UK, where they state that they feel the institutions like the Natural History Museum would be unlikely to repatriate human remains, and this is because their sort of prediction was that if you had a large amount of items like human remains in a collection, you would be less likely to want to repatriate it because it consists of so much of your collection compared to, an institution which only has a small collection of human remains. They might be more likely to repatriate it. And then we also look at some more recent articles talking about the museum kind of in a broader context. So we see UK museums aren't lagging behind repatriation, so that indicates that a lot of the literature says that we are compared to Europe and globally. But also there's some observations that London museums are lagging behind regional museums. So these are just a couple of little nuggets of information and predictions and observations from other research, so we can take this literature and see how closely it resembles the data that we collected. quick sip of coffee. So, how did we gather this information? Part of this research was that we wanted the methodology to be reasonably accessible, which meant that the information sources that we were using needed to be accessible as well. So we were focusing on mostly online material. So this meant that we were looking at a couple of other projects which collate repatriation news and information. So a couple of ones that we used was Returning Heritage and the Museum Association's news archive on repatriation, and a slightly older project, which is Organism, for some of the early case studies. And these are just a place where we could go through and see what case studies that fit in the scope of the research. And then from there, go directly to the institutions that were involved to get more accurate information and to confirm that these repatriations had occurred. So another source that we found that was really useful during this process is that some governmental projects which help facilitate repatriation will have a big list of basically all the repatriation projects that have gone there. So the example here is the Australian government program. So that was a very useful source of information. Obviously, they don't just list the UK, so it's a matter of going through and filtering out the case studies that are directly relevant to the UK sector. And then going back to making this methodology accessible, we took this information using a set of criteria and made it into an Excel spreadsheet. Quite simple. And then we also enriched this data with other projects information. So for UK institutions, the Mapping Museums project was an excellent source of information. They've been collecting information about the UK sector, and it's some really fantastic work. So it was great to have that resource to really enrich our data set. And then from there, we conducted some statistical analysis. So we'll now go into the main findings that came from this research. So in summary, we managed to identify 29 case studies. Of these, they were repatriations by 22 different UK institutions. So some institutions have, over this period, conducted more than one repatriation case. Overall, we found we were able to identify 491 items were repatriated, and repatriations went to only 7 different countries. So this is a great start to kind of know what the sector has done over this period, but we can do better than that. We can have a little bit more, get a little bit more information on this. So what kind of material was repatriated? So this is out of everything. We see that around 2/3 of everything repatriated were human remains. So quite a high amount. And if we start from the top and go around, so restricted material. So this is material that in general is still part of an active religious, has an active religious purpose, and as part of kind of that religious belief system, the people who should have access to material are considered as restricted. So that's why we've highlighted that particular type of item, because it indicates that a lot, that 7% of the material, it's kind of going straight back to kind of a community use. We've got, and then 11% is cultural heritage material. So, this is a large mix of material. And then interestingly, about 13% of the items, we weren't, from the publicly available resources, we weren't able to identify the type of material that we weren't able to identify what that material was. So most of the time it would be cultural heritage, but but they didn't have that information, so we couldn't say for sure basically what it was. So this tended to be because a lot of the information was coming from things like press releases, and sometimes they will say 50 objects were repatriated and we're not able to individually identify them. So there's a little bit of a gap in what information is publicly accessible, and that might be something museums want to consider for transparency when conducting repatriations. But we're also looking at the sector and specific case studies. So if we break down so for each case study, were they returning one type of material or was it a mixture of material? So we see from this, it's most repatriation cases, they're only returning a particular type of material. It's either human remains or cultural heritage, and only about 7% are doing mixture of both. Those case studies are mainly because it's grave goods being returned alongside human remains. But so this indicates that institutional policy tends to focus on one type of material. So that's just something to consider going forward. And then we have a look at where our item's going to. Sorry. So where is material going to? The vast majority are going to Australia and New Zealand by quite a large margin. We're seeing quite a bit of material going back to Nigeria. And then much smaller amounts is, the US, Canada, India, and very, very small. I think it was only 2 objects going two remains going back to Ethiopia. So there's definitely quite a narrow set of countries where repatriations are going back to. And I think this is really highlighted if we kind of map it out. So material is going to these specific areas, but there's a lot of places where it's not going back to. There's very little, there is no South American material going back. There's nothing going back to Europe or East Asia. And it's a very select bit of Africa where repatriation is going back to. So the scope of repatriations is quite narrow. And we'll have a look at a little bit more detail in that later. And then if we look at what kind of institutions are repatriations going back to, we see the vast majority are going directly, the ownership is being transferred directly back to Indigenous communities. The smallest amount are going back to national museums. And we see that there's no other examples of different types of museums. It's just the national ones. It's not going back to local museums. Although, even though the ownership is being transferred to the Indigenous community, sometimes they keep the objects in an indigenously run museum. So this doesn't quite capture the whole picture, but it just gives an indication on who's kind of in charge of these objects. And then we also see a reasonable amount of material are kind of going directly to like a national governmental agency as well. But we'll have a little look, a closer look at that a little bit later. And then we're looking at, so where in the UK are repatriations coming from? Is London really falling behind regional areas? So from this research, the majority of items, so we got, 75% are coming from London-based institutions. The rest are coming from England, and there's a very small amount coming from Scotland. There are no examples of anything being repatriated from Northern Ireland or Wales. So this kind of contradicts what that earlier article was that we saw was stating. But I will also highlight that just the sheer amount of objects doesn't fully capture the whole sector, because we see that England has the largest amount of individual case studies. So this indicates that a lot of places are conducting repatriations, but it's just smaller amounts of material. So it's important to consider that when looking at this through a statistical lens. And then if we break this down a little bit further, we quite surprisingly to me was that we see most of the items, so this is about 2/3 of everything, are being repatriated by a government, a national museum in the UK. So as we were talking earlier about the impact that repatriation has on legislation. So UK national museums are restricted on what kind of material that they can repatriate. They can only repatriate human remains. And we know that most of the repatriations that have occurred are human remains. So everything in that national column are human remains being repatriated by the Natural History Museum. So that's also why London is such a big spike in the data. It's because the Natural History Museum has repatriated a lot of human remains over this period. So apart from that specific spike, we see a variety of other types of institutions conducting repatriations, and contradicting that 1997 survey, we see that university museums are conducting quite a few repatriations. So this is a change from the 1990s. University museums are conducting a lot of repatriations now, well, over this period. So we have all that information, but has this changed over time? So if we put all of the repatriated items, so this is the year that they were repatriated, we can see that repatriations over this period are quite inconsistent year on year. Some years, there's a lot of stuff being repatriated. Other years, there's absolutely nothing being repatriated. And this kind of reinforces what we already knew about the repatriation practice, that it takes a lot of time to get through. It's not necessarily a systematic process. It's case by case, causing a lot of these spikes. But one thing that this chart just shows is that there is a slight increase in repatriations over this 12-year period. Not very much, but there is a slight trend towards that. And we will have a look at that a little bit more detailed in this one. So, this shows a lot of information, but if we break it down, we get a much better understanding on what's actually going on here. So if we have a look at the type of material that has been repatriated, we see a difference between human remains being repatriated and cultural heritage material. Over this period, human remains is a fairly consistent. Human remains are being repatriated at the start of this period, is still being repatriated by the end. It's a very steady amount. But when we look at cultural heritage items, this changes. There's only a small amount in 2014 going, but it's really from 2019, we see the amount of cultural heritage material increase. So that little increase we saw in the previous slide, most of that is counted for by cultural heritage material increasing towards the end of this period. So this indicates that the repatriation practice in the sector is changing. The type of objects that they're looking at repatriation is, diversifying away from just human remains. They're looking at cultural heritage material a lot more. And then if we break this down again by the countries where repatriations were occurring, we see that before 2019, there was only 4 countries where repatriations were going to. It was Australia, New Zealand, the US, and Canada before then. And it's only from 2019 that we see the Ethiopian material appear. We see the Nigerian material and appear, and also the Indian material appear. So not only is there an increase in cultural heritage material going back, the countries that are having repatriations go back to is also diversifying towards the end of this period. And, you know, this is especially significant in, you know, 2022, where, you know, before we only have, I think it's 1 case study of Nigerian material. And then by 2022, we've got a large amount of Nigerian material going back. So it's quite a rapid change following the trend in cultural heritage material. And then we also see that the type of institution that is having material returned to is also changing. So while Indigenous communities and national museums are still getting repatriations, it's only from this 2019 period that we see that material has been directly repatriated to government agencies. So this can be like an embassy or the like cultural departments are going back to. So towards the end of this period, we see a lot of things are starting to change. So in addition to information about where material is being repatriated from and the type of institutions and so on, we also collected some other data points where it was available. And 3 of these points were: when were the UK institutions opened? We also looked at when the material was initially removed from the place of origin. And we also looked at when these institutions had acquired these items. So if we look at, this shows, so over time, as an institution opens, the graph gets bigger, basically. And this doesn't include quite all of the institutions, but we see that the majority, I can't see because things in the way, but the majority of them have been opened by around 1900. So the institutions that are conducting repatriations, these are older institutions with older collections. And then from this, if we add in when were items removed from their place of origin, sorry, excuse me. And we get something a little bit interesting. You'll notice that this only includes about 140 objects. So only a small amount of the items that we were able to identify did we have the information about when they were removed. So this is only a small amount of the overall case studies that we're looking at. But those that we do have information from, there is a very clear spike in the middle of this graph. You know, you see around 1895. So that spike is caused by the Nigerian material, which was Benin bronze material. So this was, and we can identify very clearly where this material came from because it was part of a punitive expedition by the British Army in the Kingdom of Benin, where they looted a whole bunch of the royal palace material. So this is a very, this material is very easy to identify because it wasn't traded beforehand, it was just royal material. So that is why we are able to identify so clearly when that was removed. So this is in 1897, I believe, is when that really big spike happens. And then if we add on to this, when museums were acquiring items, we see another very large spike quite soon after that big spike in removals. So this is kind of a demonstration on, once you have this information, it kind of, it's a way of examining what the potential relationship was between colonial practices by the UK and how that relates to museum collecting practices over the colonial period. So this isn't a perfect demonstration, but I think it kind of highlights why it's important to collect this information. And I think this would be a really interesting area to kind of look into further. So those were the main findings. So what can the sector expect going forward? As we saw, we're kind of at the start of a change in how sector practice and the sector's approach to repatriations. We're getting a lot more cultural heritage items. They're looking at a wider set of material from a broader range of countries of origin. Where they're being repatriated, the organizations they're being repatriated to is changing. And we see this continue with more recent case studies. So after 2022, so in 2024, we had the first repatriation by the Pitt Rivers Museum of cultural heritage material, and also material going to Malaysia. So this trend seems to be continuing going forward. So this is something to consider when developing policy or looking at guidance, is that the profile of objects being repatriated is changing, and it is important to reflect that going forward. So some further research questions. This research was very much kind of establishing what sector practice is in a little screenshot of time. I think it brings up a lot of interesting questions. I think especially why some regions are not included in this. So going way back to the 1997 survey, you know, they bring up countries where there was an extensive excavation history, like Egypt, and we don't see Egypt in any of this. So having an examination on why certain countries aren't included would be an interesting route to take. We also didn't record what the listed reasons were for repatriation, because each organization is going to have a slightly different process behind it. But that might be quite revelatory on kind of why the sector looks like this. And also taking this methodology and applying it to other countries, other regions, to see how kind of the UK practice compares to, you know, a wider context. Like if we look at other European nations with a similar colonial history, is it very similar or is it very different? So there's a lot of interesting questions that come up from this research. Which leads me to, if any of you have questions, also feel free to, if you have any further questions and you're not here, or you've just watched it later in the future, you can email me, or if you want a copy of the database, I'm very happy to share that with you, or any of the original research, because, you know, it goes a little bit more in depth than what we've had today. But yeah, thank you. Do I need to stop recording? I'll let you do that.
Okay. So while I'm stopping the recording.